And now let's get into the second signal that keeps us silver stacking. And this is one that we sort of fell in more recently. We've gotten into it definitely with the budget that's recently come out up here in Canada, and I should mention just the federal budget. We really kind of dug into just the numbers at this point, and it was something that we definitely had to do.
Yeah.
It kind of took us by surprise, I would say, about $30 billion just this year alone in the federal budget's deficit.
Yeah, for sure. We were surprised, but we too were a little bit cautious. I mean, we knew how they ran on a platform of 10 billion, and when you run on a platform of 10 billion, you know it's probably going to end up just a little bit more than that. So
that's a good point.
Yeah.
And also too, just it wasn't just 30 billion in deficit this year. It was an additional 113 billion dollars over the next 5 years.
That's right.
And that's if everything goes perfect, because we also did a video discussing how they didn't take into account any risks.
Yeah.
And they also sort of overestimated on a lot of the numbers that they crunched. But let's just get into this. So what we did was we looked at an RBC, which is a bank up here in Canada, and we just looked at all of the provincial budgets up here in Canada. So each province has their own budget. Again, Ontario, Alberta, all of these provinces. And we were shocked but not shocked to see that all of the provinces, all 10, including the federal government, so if we create sort of an 11th number for them, 10 out of the 11 are in deficits for their own provincial budgets. The only province that isn't running a deficit this year or next year is the province of British Columbia. And as we'll see, it's a very small surplus, particularly when you look at the last couple of years. They've run pretty big deficits.
for sure.
So let's just run down this quickly. We'll start with BC. Let's just look at all the budget deficits and surpluses for this year, so 2016 and 2017. And let's see just how shocking these provincial budgets are, especially when you have people like David Rosenberg, who we looked at his article a couple of episodes ago,
yeah.
who are saying that the provinces are well ahead of the federal government and starting to balance their budget.
Exactly. And when people talk about debt, they usually only focus on the federal number.
Yeah.
They don't like to talk about these provincial debt numbers. So
No.
let's take a look at these, because these are pretty interesting.
So the first one for this year for BC, a $264 million surplus. So they're the only province.
Which sounds good, right?
Yeah, which sounds good. But even if you just look in 2012, 2013, it was a 1.2 roughly billion dollar deficit. So they're making some progress in a good direction. But let's look at Alberta. Or is this? Yeah, Alberta's the next one. In this year alone, they're going to go, I guess they followed the Liberal running platform, because they're going to have $10.4 billion in deficit.
Yeah, just Alberta.
Yeah, so just one single province, and it's not even, I wouldn't even say it's the third biggest province. I think British Columbia has a bigger population than Alberta.
Yeah, I think you're right.
So at least the fourth biggest province, most likely, is running a $10 billion deficit, which is what our federal government ran on and supposedly had a mandate for. So that just shows you, I think, where Alberta is in the scheme of their own provincial budget. And it's funny too, because for next year and the year after that, so in 2017-18, they're going to go another 10 billion they've projected, and then in 18 and 19, another roughly $8.5 billion in deficit. So Alberta's just in an awful place with their budget, and Alberta has been sort of the shining beacon of Canadian provinces. They rarely ran deficits all through the 90s and early 2000s. They've had the big boom from the oil and gas industry. So it's not good to see Alberta follow all the other provinces in their budget deficits. And then if we look at Saskatchewan in this year, they're going to go $259 million into debt.
Yeah, so there's sort of your trade-off with BC already.
Exactly. So we've already got rid of BC and added 10 for Alberta.
Yeah.
And then Manitoba, they're looking at a $619 million deficit. Ontario, they're going to go 5.7 this year. And then in the upcoming year, sorry, that was last year. And then this year, they're going to go $4.3 billion in debt.
And that's just Ontario being Ontario, pretty much.
Right.
They've been, over the last few years, they've been running huge deficits.
Well, yeah, look at this year. In 2012, 2009, 2010, they went 19 and a half almost. So $19.5 billion, which is 2/3 of the federal debt that's this year.
And even with all those deficits, still more to come.
Right. And Quebec, they haven't projected any numbers for last year or this year, but in their most recent budget deficit that we do have numbers for, it was $1.1 billion in debt.
And they've also, that seems to be the lowest, the best deficit they've run in the last 6 years. So
right. And so it'd be interesting to see what they do. But I do think on a per capita basis that Quebec is probably the worst off on their debt to GDP ratio.
Yeah, there's not a lot of positives on that chart.
No, it's a lot of budget deficits for Quebec and Ontario too, to be fair. And then we have the good old province of New Brunswick. They feel it necessary for this year to go $347 million in debt. And they've actually projected all the way out to 2019, 2020 to run budget deficits. For Nova Scotia, we don't have this year's numbers, but last year they went $235 million in debt. And then the tiny Canadian province of Prince Edward Island, they only have a population of 150,000 roughly. They're going to go $33 million in debt, which doesn't look like a lot, but I ran the numbers for the per capita basis of Ontario and PEI for the last year's $5.7 billion deficit. It worked out to be about $413 per citizen in Ontario. But for this $33 million deficit in PEI, that's going to be about $225, I think it was. Okay. So it's on a per capita basis, it's still quite significant. Yep. And then Newfoundland and Labrador.
Yeah, we were very surprised with these numbers.
Very surprised that this was still a province. But no, but the Newfoundland and Labrador, they're going to go $1.8 billion in debt. And that's another population-wise very small province here in Canada. So, and that was on top of last year's $2.2 billion. So
and if you look at the next few years on that chart.
Yeah, they've actually projected deficits all the way out until 2022, 2023.
And they're not small.
No, they're almost each one is at $1 billion.
Yeah, almost each one at $1 billion, and then it seems like in 22, 23, their lowest is about $561 million.
Right, and then of course the federal government. We've touched on this again, about $30 billion in debt this year, and then deficits all the way out for the next 5 years. So that's where we are just on these budget deficits. So that's year to year. If you look at the net debt numbers, it's not like this is something that's just occurred and comes out of nowhere. The net debt, so if you look at each of the total debt numbers, again, let's just go with this year again. We'll run through these quick. Again, BC, they're $42 billion in debt. So British Columbia. Alberta, again, they've done good all the way through the 2000s and even the 1990s. They're going to go for the first time into $10 billion in debt. And that's the first time that they've really run a deficit in the country since the year 2000. Then we have Saskatchewan. They're $6.7 billion in debt. Manitoba's $21. Ontario, this year they're going to be $308 billion in debt, which is almost exactly half of the federal government's total debt load. Quebec, $188 billion. New Brunswick is $13.5 billion. Nova Scotia, $15.5, and then Prince Edward Island, $2.1. Newfoundland and Labrador is about $14.5 billion, and then of course the highest number of the federal government, $650 billion in debt.
So that's a lot of debt.
Right. So I hope we've made the point. The provinces and the federal government up here in Canada are in a ton of debt. We ran the numbers just looking at for this year. It's roughly $1.3 trillion in debt. And we've already just said it too, the total money stock up here in Canada is $1.4 trillion. So even if you were to take pretty much every dollar that's in existence in the current system, then you couldn't pay off the debt. You would have about $100 billion left over for every man, woman, and child in Canada to do what they wanted.
And in a couple of years, you're not even going to have that left. So
right,
maybe within the next year.
Exactly. So as you can see with these debt numbers, every province and the federal government, they're all in debt. If you look at their budgets of today, Every province and the federal government, except for British Columbia, which probably will change in a couple of years anyway, the trend is continuing. All of these provinces and the federal government is continuing to get themselves into more and more debt. And let's talk a little bit about why you're going to have to inflate and why we look at this as a signal just to keep silver stacking is for the exact reason that we just mentioned. You can't pay off all this debt with the current amount of money that's in existence. Again, something has to give. So what they do, and I think this is exactly why interest rates are so important as well, that they're going to have to inflate their way to get out of this type of debt load. There's only what you can do, one of two ways to pay these debts. You can either tax the population or you can inflate.
That's right. And they're probably not going to tax, because that's not a very good political platform to run on.
Right. Nobody's going to run on, well, let's pay off all the, Ontario, we're going to dip into that $308 billion deficit. We're just going to need to increase the taxes to 75% of your income.
Yeah, we're going to go the Bernie Sanders route.
Right, yeah. And even then, the thing is, too, is not only is it just bad politically, it's not politically feasible to run on a platform like that. People look at and people know that where taxes are right now is pretty much the maximum that you're going to get from people. Because I think there's institutes up here in Canada, like the Fraser Institute, which I guess ironically is out in BC, and BC is running the only surplus. But if you look at the Fraser Institute, they basically say that where taxes are now, maybe there's a little bit more room to get, but if you tax any higher, you'll actually decrease tax revenues because people will just not be incentivized to work. Right. Or at least they'll lower their productivity. Why would somebody work 50 hours a week when they're getting taxed so high? They'll probably only work 30 hours a week.
Right. Or they might move.
Yeah, or they could move.
Yeah.
So not only is it politically unfeasible to run on a platform like that, there's just no more room in the tax base to be able to get that type of money. So the only way that you're going to pay off these debts, you could just repudiate the debt entirely and just say we're not going to pay, but governments just don't do that in the modern age. And actually that repudiation of debt, where they just say we're not going to pay, that was Murray Rothbard's platform and Ron Paul's platform in the last election cycle. The best case, because they know if you inflate, that's a hidden tax. So the inflation tax is probably what's going to occur up here in Canada. And again, that's a major signal to us. If the tax base is doubled from 2007, if they're going to have to pay off all these debts and go in the right direction, how high is the tax base, the monetary base, going to have to be? Maybe it moves to 2 trillion. Maybe it goes to 5 trillion. Who knows? It's going to be most likely somewhere higher than what it is now. So we're watching these federal and provincial numbers quite intently now, no more than I've done in the past. Yeah. I would just kind of roll my eyes and just say, well, it's not a good economic policy to pursue. But now we're looking at it just in terms of our silver stacking as well. I didn't know that the numbers were this high in relation to that total M2 number.
Me too.